Well, Douglas, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to be in Mississippi and be able to breathe the air of freedom. And I mean that quite literally. It's wonderful to see you all unmuzzled and showing your faces and showing thereby your support for personal autonomy. It is so exciting to be here. You see, if I were a US politician, I'd have to say the great state of Mississippi. But let me instead say the forward-looking, bold, quizzical, and innovative state of Mississippi. I have to do a Zoom call this week with some students in California. And the organizer said, remember that Mississippi is 2 hours ahead of California. I said, no, Mississippi is 2 years ahead of California. You guys are still wandering around with all of your closures and your restrictions and your mask mandates. And my friend who is, how can I describe, my friend is a little bit like, do you remember the Big Lebowski from the film? He's a slightly kind of surfer, so I mean, he's an older version. And he goes, yeah, you're right. He said, I never thought I'd see the day where I can buy cannabis openly and legally, but I have to meet my barber down a back alley, you know. So well done on being a more open state. And what a pleasure to be in the state where Ronald Reagan launched his campaign at Neshoba. Now, you'll all be much too young to remember Ronald Reagan. I can see looking around that there's no one in this room, with the possible exception of Jim, that there's no one in this room who will be young enough to remember. But it was, of course, at the Neshoba Fair that he began the project of restoration of American greatness. And he did it by reconnecting this country to its foundational creeds, by being the ultimate citizen legislator who saw it as his job not to snatch at the levers of control, but rather to push powers back out and to trust to the genius of a great people. And that, it seems to me, is the fundamental role of the Mississippi Center. And this is what I mean when I talk about Mississippi being innovative, planting the flag, always a little bit in advance of the van of the army, on the legislation on critical race theory, on school choice, on the abolition of income tax. So to every one of you who has supported this centre and its work, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, and congratulations. Congratulations on your choice of CEO. You could not have picked a better leader than Douglas. There is no one... There's no one who shares both his commitment, his depth of patriotism, and despite what he says about needing to lean on Annika for everything, his ability actually to deliver. And I can see that already with, I think, thanks to you, Hunter, I think now the previously rather sleepy website of this centre is now, you know, the most watched thing after Fox News or something similar, which, and you're just getting started, which is fantastic. So thank you for Douglas. It was our loss and your gain. The one politician who could get re-elected in his own name under different party colours in the UK, now bringing that energy and enterprise here. And if we can just self-indulgently add one thing, about Douglas and about my goddaughter Kitty. I can remember very well the day that Kitty was baptised. And it's, in a way, a story that is revealing of the depth of ideological commitment to the liberty cause of her father. Because Douglas insisted on having her baptised in a church in a little town called Burford, which in the year 1649 was the scene of a quite atrocious shooting. There were a number of rebels who had fought for the parliamentary cause in the English Civil War, fought against the monarchy, and who, as the victorious parliamentary cause began to descend into military rule and dictatorship, stood by their principles and continued to argue for democracy, for personal freedom, for free trade, for personal autonomy. And these were a group of people who became known as the Levelers. And they were really the first kind of libertarian radicals. They were the link in the golden chain that went from Magna Carta to the old courthouse in Philadelphia. Well, they were led into the churchyard, they were imprisoned there. Some of them scratched their names in the font, and then 3 of them who refused to recant were led out and shot. And the place where they fell below the muskets is almost a pilgrimage site now. They gave their lives for the cause of liberty. And I knew that Douglas would want some of their spirit to rub off into Kitty, which is why he was so determined on this venue. And I knew that day that she would grow into an exceptional young woman, and I can assure you now, Douglas, that I've never had any concerns about her spiritual health. I'm going to carry on worrying about yours, as I have all of our lives. I know that she is in the best possible hands here. And really, that's all I have to say, so thank you for inviting me. But while I'm on my feet, let me just say one more thing. The role of organisations like this is partly to educate, to inculcate, to teach kids that they are not just a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals, but that they are inheritors of an extraordinary heritage, an extraordinary and sublime patrimony. And I want to take you back in exploring that patrimony. I want to take you back to August 1941. To the longest walk of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. It's an odd thing, almost unimaginable today, but the media of FDR's time conspired to hide the fact of the president's podium. Try and imagine that today. Every photograph showed him seated or standing unaided. But on that day, he was determined at any cost to walk, because he was going to meet Winston Churchill on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales. And his advisor said, "Don't do it, Mr. President, it's a ship. What if it pitches and throws you in a heap? It's not going to be very dignified." He said, "No, I'm going to walk." And so very slowly, supported by his son on one arm and by a naval officer on the other, he made his way across the deck while the band of the British warship struck up Stars and Stripes forever. And what followed was the most extraordinary demonstration of what binds our peoples together. It happened to be a Sunday morning, and so Churchill had the crews of the 2 vessels, USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, paraded for a joint religious service. He had chosen every detail himself with meticulous care, down to the hymns, down to the readings that the chaplain gave from the pulpit. His text was from Joshua 1, chapter 5, "As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage." And afterwards, exultantly, Churchill burst out, the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, he wasn't making a bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it was in August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass was under one form or another of tyranny, either Soviet tyranny or fascist tyranny. Freedom was thrown back to its heartlands of the English-speaking peoples. There was, nowadays we talk about the values of freedom as almost as though they were the natural state of an advanced society, right? Almost as though you didn't have to do any work, that when you get there, you get rich enough, automatically it comes. You get the rest of it. You get the uncensored newspapers and the free elections and the equality between the sexes and the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights and habeas corpus. Not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. We call those things universal values because we're being polite. Right? I mean, they were overwhelming precepts developed in the language in which you're listening to these words. And when we look at what's happening in the world now, when we look at what's the real cause of the fighting in Ukraine, isn't it fundamentally about whether Ukrainians can choose our path, whether they can adopt something more like the Anglo-American model, a system that elevates the rules above the rulers. A system that elevates the individual above the collective, rather than the more common despotic form of government where the people in charge get to make up the rules as they go along, and there's not much that can be done about it. Now here's the point. It's so easy to be blasé, isn't it? It's so easy to take for granted the things that we've grown up with. But all of those exceptional principles, all of those safeguards against excessive state power are exceptional, contingent, fragile. And without constant work to defend them and to acculturate future generations so that they grow up understanding and valuing them, we will default to the mean. Right? By far the more common form of social organization the world over has been one based around tribe, hierarchy, and brute force. There was a British Prime Minister between the wars, not a very ideological man. He was technically a conservative, but I think he was whatever the British equivalent of Rhino is, called Stanley Baldwin. And towards the end of his life, he was asked, were you ever influenced by any writers, any thinkers, any theorists? And rather to the surprise of his interviewer, because Baldwin was not a man who read books, Baldwin said, actually, yes, I was. As a young man, I was very much influenced by the theories of Sir Henry Maine, the great Victorian anthropologist and jurist, and it was by reading his works and understanding his message that I came to see that all human history is the story of the move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? Right? It's a cute story. It shows that even the most brilliant ideas become worn through overuse. But just think for a second about those three words, status to contract. For almost all of human civilization, our relations one with another were defined by birth, by caste, by tradition. The exceptional breakthrough that happened among the English-speaking peoples first and then spread was the idea that we are all valued as free individuals, able to make our own relations one with another voluntarily. Simple as that. Grant that, and the rest of it follows. And it only happened once. This is the amazing thing. This is why I say it's so contingent. It happened once, in one place, in 10,000 years of post-agrarian history. And if we don't work to defend it, it can very easily return to the primal swamp, the more ordinary way of doing things. It's the second law of thermodynamics. Everything will tend back to chaos. It was, 10,000 years ago that somebody dropped a seed in the ground and noticed that a plant would grow there, right? The beginning of civilization, the beginning of agriculture, beginning of writing, beginning of cities. Yeah. It took about 10 minutes, I suspect, before the next discovery, which was, it's actually, if you really want return on investment, it's easier to wait for somebody else to do all the work and then steal his harvest, rather than spend all year tending to your own crops. And then it was probably about 10 minutes after that that the most lethal breakthrough of all came, which is that if you absolutely wanted to get the best ratio of effort to outcome, then you would regularize that pillage, that theft, through a series of tithes and tolls and taxes, and thus was the state born in tyranny. Thus was civilization born in oppression. That's why every one of us in this room is descended from slaves and from slave owners, right? It was a universal phenomenon on every continent and in every archipelago. The lot of almost every human being was toil from sunset to dusk, while history was the history of the top 1% of the top 1%, right? Until this extraordinary breakthrough. Until this extraordinary decision to value the individual above the collective. A decision that made its breakthrough and achieved contractual form in Runnymede in 1215. The great Texan jurist Hatton Sumner said, a straight road runs from Runnymede to Philadelphia. He understood that the US Constitution was based on an inheritance, an accumulated inheritance of the widening of personal rights. And I think Americans have always seen this. perhaps more clearly than Brits have. The old site of where Magna Carta was formed, Runnymede, used to be in my district when I was in the European Parliament. As good a claim as anywhere on the planet to be the place where freedom was born. Do you know that until the 800th anniversary in 2015, it was completely unmarked, except for one monument raised there by the American Bar Association. It was the only memorial in the place. And I think this is because yours was a republic based around these sublime ideals, that the laws matter more than the people who make them. This extraordinary idea that above the king, above the most powerful guy in the tribe, is something that you can't see or touch or hear, but that binds the king as surely as it binds his poorest subject. And that something is the law. There are 4 original copies of the Great Charter. 2 of them are in the British Library, one in Lincoln Cathedral, one in Salisbury Cathedral. In fact, for the 800th anniversary, they were all, for the first time since 1215, they were all gathered together in the British Library. And I couldn't resist going, and I was staring at them longingly, droolingly, and I saw that somebody had surreptitiously photographed me while I was doing this, and then they put this thing on Twitter, this picture of me saying, if Hannan gets his hands on all 4 copies of Magna Carta, will he be like Sauron with all of the rings? You know, which is a good question. That copy from Lincoln Cathedral, you go there now. There's no queue, or no line, as you would say. There's no fuss. Right? You can go right up to it, no big deal. The same copy was displayed in New York for the 1939 World Expo. And an almost unbelievable 17 million people crushed in to see it. The Second World War broke out while it was still on display. So it was transferred to Fort Knox for safekeeping. The aptest possible symbol of what we were fighting for then, the aptest possible symbol of what our countries stand for today. A country based on rules, a country based on human dignity. Here's the point that we find hardest, right? Because all of us have been lucky enough to grow up with such a system, because we've all been lucky enough to be taught its precepts, I think we can make the mistake of thinking that there's something permanent about them, that they were an end destination. But really, there's no reason to believe that. There's a series of indices out there that measure the state of freedom and democracy on the planet. There's something called Freedom House. There's the Economist Intelligence Unit. There's a thing called the Democracy Index. And they all tell the same story. After advancing for about 70 years, at some point between 2010 and 2015, democratization stalled and began to go into reverse. And there are a number of reasons for that. Of course, the process has been accelerated by these lockdowns and the massive increase in state power that followed. But one of the reasons why it's going into reverse is that we are no longer teaching people the values on which it rests. We're no longer teaching people about John Locke and J.S. Mill and John Milton and the other apostles of freedom. I think it was, you know who I mean by Hannah Arendt, the German-American philosopher, the woman who chronicled the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. She had a great phrase. She said, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And what she means by that is, you and I came into the world with pretty much the same mental apparatus that our ancestors would have done 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, right? The reason that we do not live in the brutal world that we would have done then is because we have habituated people, taught people a different way of behaving. We have an accumulated culture, greater than any generation could create on its own, based on what's gone before. And the work of parents and the work of schools and the work of universities is to teach people how to function in that culture. And that means teaching them some pretty counterintuitive things. Right? None of this comes naturally. The idea, for example, that someone that you don't like might still have a point worth listening to is, as we all know on one level, quite an unnatural idea. We have to be taught it. Right? The idea that the rules matter more than the rulers. The idea that process matters more than outcome. That is an extraordinarily difficult, counterintuitive idea, right? Literally counterintuitive. It runs up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genome. And yet, without it, see how quickly the comforts and freedoms that we take for granted would survive. What an extraordinary thing in this country, that people for all those years were prepared to elevate a desiccated piece of parchment now hanging in the National Archives over the real flesh and blood candidate who happened to be the leader of their party. How extraordinary that people were willing to accept election results when their guy lost. Now, I'm sure you can work out where this is going, right? You see how fragile that is. We are now reaching the point in this country where almost automatically the losers will go to law and try and overturn an election result. And I make this point in a supremely non-partisan spirit, right? They're both at it. And in a way, how odd that it lasted as long as it did, right? But the reason that we are now returning to these kind of pre-modern impulses, the reason that we're becoming tribal and polarized again, is because we are failing, and particularly our institutions of learning are failing to teach the difficult truths. In fact, not only are they not teaching the counter-cyclical, difficult idea of individualism, they are increasingly teaching the pro-cyclical idea that tribe is the only thing that matters. They are teaching people that the only thing really that matters about them is that they're female or white or whatever it is. In other words, they are going back to the pre-modern notion of caste, the pre-modern notion that we are defined by accident of birth and physiognomy, and that our personal choices no longer count. I can remember, as a small child, I must have been 9 or 10 years old, a friend of my parents being unspeakably rude to a young couple that he'd just met. So much so that my parents left. And afterwards, my mother had a go at this man and said, how could you have been so unpleasant to that couple? You'd never met them before. And my parents' friend said, oh, I had enough of French Canadians in the war. Right? Now, even age 9, I could see the pretty fundamental flaw, right? Which is that whatever issue he'd had with French Canadians, it wasn't with that young couple. But here's the disquieting thought, right? I, like you, if you were on my side in that anecdote, we are the odd ones. We've been taught to think that way. My parents' disagreeable friend was the one who would have been the much more recognizable figure for almost the whole of human history up until an eye blink ago, where you do indeed define people by tribe and caste. And that's why I get so worried when I look at what's happening in this country and is now spreading across the rest of the Anglosphere. This increasing tendency to define everything by accident of birth and physical resemblance. This terrifying idea that 2 American babies, born on the same day, can arrive with a set of pre-existing grievances based on their resemblance to somebody who lived a long time ago. No open, pluralist society can survive on that basis. And if our schools and universities are not prepared to elevate the individual, then it falls to organizations like this. And it falls to the people in this room to take up that task. I want to leave time for a little bit of discussion, so let me just close with a heartfelt imprecation from a British conservative who loves his country to American conservatives who still believe in theirs. Honor the vision of your founders. Don't be afraid to teach your children their sublime inheritance. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part. On which note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've got, 10 or 15 minutes, so if you're happy, Douglas, I'll just say, so please just wave your hand in the air if you want to. And if you want to come back on anything else, if you want to talk about Brexit or whatever, I'm quite happy to do that. We don't have to limit our conversation to Hannah Arendt and freedom. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the retrenchment of freedom and why that occurred. Do you think the rise of technology and social media is somehow related to that? Because the timing seems to be congruent.
It's a very good question. Yes, I do think it has. So for those who didn't hear the question, is this retrenchment of freedom, is this process being partly driven by, or is it linked to, the rise of social media? I think there's a number of things going on. My degree was in history, and one thing it taught me is that there is almost never a single simple answer when you detect a major change like this. There's usually more than one factor. Definitely, social media encourages tribalism, encourages us to think with our lizard brains, encourages us into an us and them mentality. I was just talking to Douglas actually this morning. There was a book that came out about 5 years ago from a couple of politics professors in North Carolina called Pick Up or Prius. And it was about the division of the United States into two barely interconnecting tribes who, the scariest statistic for me in the whole book, in 2016, I think it was, more than half of Republicans admitted to hating Democrats, and more than half of Democrats admitted to hating Republicans. Hate is a very strong word, and a very ugly and debilitating emotion. But that would have been unrecognizable even 20 years earlier. So something has happened, and it's happening around the world, but the US is a little bit further down the road. It may well have to do with social media. It may well have to do with a lack of homogeneity. So when people say the last election was the most bitter election ever, come on, election of 1800? And especially for any Hamilton fans here, you'll remember that. That was kind of an election of 1860. I think I'm on safe ground saying that in Mississippi, right? I mean, there have been more viciously contested elections. Maybe, really scary thought, maybe the mid and late 20th century was the exception. Maybe the tribalism, the polarization, used to be much more widespread, and we're simply returning. Where, if you like, we're coming to the end of the interglacial, and we're returning to the snowscapes on either side of it. And why would that be? Well, I think a couple of exceptional things about the mid and late 20th century here. First of all, because there were significant curbs on immigration introduced in the 1920s, that was the one period when there was an exceptionally high native-born population, and there was exceptional homogeneity that went with that. There were 3 channels on TV, everyone went to the same kind of school, everyone got the same basic message from the same media. People felt this affinity, this community, one with another, based on shared habits and shared upbringing. Much, much harder. You have to work that much harder to assimilate large numbers of newcomers. It can be done. I loved Ronald Reagan's phrase that every immigrant makes America more American. It was a wonderfully, typically optimistic phrase of the Gippers, but you have to work at it. It doesn't happen on its own. One other factor that may be behind it, for the period of, from the sort of, let's say the early 30s until the 90s, there was an external enemy. There was fascism, there was Imperial Japan, and then, of course, there was Soviet communism. Take that away and see how quickly people have gone back to finding enemies within. So I don't know whether it's, take your pick, ladies and gentlemen, out of those explanations. The real question is, what can we do about it? And that really has to be a process of education. One small example. Over the summer, I taught at a summer school in the UK. And at the introductory session, these were kids of 16, 17. And the guy running it was called the John Locke Institute, rather aptly. The guy running it was consciously trying to inoculate these kids against woke before they went to university. He was trying to prepare them. Maybe inoculate is the wrong metaphor to use in the current, but he was trying to give them a little defense against the cancel culture that he knew that they would encounter on campus. And he began by introducing them, which I thought was great, to what he called generous listening. And generous listening means when somebody is saying something that you disagree with, generous listening means, it doesn't mean keeping quiet and waiting for your chance to jump in. It means trying to engage with where they're coming from. trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. If they use the wrong word for something, don't pounce on that word. You know, if you still disagree with them at the end, disagree with their strongest point, not with their weakest one. And I watched him over 3 weeks changing these people's attitude, right? And for example, he did the. Do you know what I mean by the ideological Turing test? This is this fantastic idea invented, I think, by Brian Kaplan. Can you argue the other side's case so well that no one can tell whether you are yourself of that persuasion, right? He had them doing this. He had all these debates where the issue would be, you know, should statues be torn down? And he would put on each side someone who actually believed in it and someone who didn't, and the audience would have to guess who, right? I wish we did that in every school. I wish we did that in every university, because unless we can teach people to engage on the basis of reason, we very quickly return to these pre-modern instincts, and that is not an outcome which does anyone any good. Time for a few more. Ladies and gentlemen, any more questions, comments, or interventions? Yes, okay, just go, Jim, I'll come to you first, of course. In what particular regard, sir?
In Europe today.
Is history repeating itself? Well, actually, I have to say I have been very pleasantly surprised by the extent to which we have learned the lessons of history when it comes to dealing with aggression. So, although some people have been scrambling to catch up with what's happening in the broad flatlands of Ukraine, I'm glad to say that the United Kingdom was training Ukrainian forces from 2015. We've had troops deployed in Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania. I think not Latvia, but the other three since 2016. If I were Vladimir Putin, I would not have expected the first week to go like this. Yeah. 2 weeks ago, he had it all. 2 weeks ago, he had Western leaders dancing attendance on him in Moscow. He had a slavishly supportive domestic media. The Chinese were on his side. The West was divided. And there were even hints, although no one wanted to quite put it in those terms, that Ukraine was prepared to shelve its NATO ambitions. He had it all, and he pushed just that one bit too far. And if he could have foreseen then that, you know, Germany would be rearming, that Turkey would have closed the straits to his shipping, and that there would be anti-war demonstrations in every Russian city, I'm not sure he would have behaved as he has. So in that sense, I like to think that we've learned. But again, we have to just keep reminding ourselves, what are we fighting for? Right? I was very struck by the extraordinary asymmetry of cancel culture and woke politics here. That it's only ever directed at American targets, or at least at Western targets. So here you'd have thought on woke grounds about the most objectionable regime possible, right? Putin's cabinet is not very gender diverse, right? It's not very ethnically diverse. It's not very LGBTQ plus friendly, right? And its policies in Ukraine are not just racist, but genocidal. He's categorizing people and inflicting violence on them. And yet we continue to agitate about the evil West and the appalling colonialism and all the rest of it. That is a kind of sickness. And there I think we haven't learnt the lessons. But I hope there is still time. Sir.
Lord, after the Soviet Union fell and the Ukraine declared its independence a few years later in 1991, they had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. Fast forward 3 years later, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, UK, United States, and Russia agreed to do whatever they could for security assurances if the Ukraine would give up their nuclear weapons. So what do you see in terms of what's happening today from the UK and the US in response to Ukraine? Is it the right policy right now, or should we be doing more?
Well, that's why we can't be indifferent to Ukraine's fate. I mean, you're absolutely, for those who didn't hear it, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons on the basis that we and Russia assured its borders, and Russia then has gone back on that. So, of course, that gives us a claim, it gives us a stake, it gives us locus in the dispute. However, we took a decision in 2008 not to admit them to NATO. And I think we took that decision rightly or wrongly, the decision was taken because people felt that Article 5 of NATO had to be believable. Potential aggressors, including Putin, had to know that crossing in anger the border of any NATO country would trigger a war with all 30 members. Now, if not every member was prepared to go to war for Ukraine, it would have been an incredible assurance, and it would have been a dishonest assurance. So effectively, we took the decision then to throw a ring of steel around the existing members, but to leave Georgia and Ukraine outside it. That doesn't mean that we leave them completely to their fate. And I don't really see how this can now end with a Russian assimilation of Ukraine. Even if, let's assume that Putin succeeds in toppling the Zelensky regime, let's assume that he is able to impose some puppet government of his own, that wouldn't be the end of it. We can be certain that there would be a continuing guerrilla war. That we can see already from how they behave that Ukrainians will not accept Kremlin rule at any price, even if the alternative is an open-ended insurgency. I think we could safely assume that Ukrainian militiamen, that maquisards, as it were, that resistance fighters would operate from bases in Poland and Romania within that ring of steel. We might even reasonably infer that there would be a recognized Ukrainian government in exile in London or wherever that would be directing them. So there is no outcome now that ends in a Russian assimilation, a Russian absorption of Ukraine. In that sense, Putin has already lost. There's nothing he can do from here. The more urgent question for him is, how secure is his regime? I mean, he must know that the only way out for an autocrat is a palace coup, usually riddled with bullets, right? There must be a little corner of his mind now thinking, if I have inflicted this level of pain on everyone around me, and they can see that ridding the government of me is the way to end all of that pain, how safe am I? I mean, I'd almost be tempted to offer him asylum. You know, Bonaparte wanted asylum in Britain after the Battle of Waterloo. I would be tempted to make the same offer to Vladimir Putin, except that I'm not sure that Russian defectors are entirely safe living under the Queen's peace in the UK, as Litvinenko and then Skripal showed. So maybe he wouldn't feel entirely secure living under the Queen's peace. But I think the issue now is not can Ukraine survive, it's how long can Putin survive. Thank you. Last one there, sir. Yes, please.
My name is John Maker from Mississippi, back in Golden here in Jackson. There are only two places in the continental United States where nuclear explosions have been done. One of them is this state, South Mississippi. Some of my friends down there tell me the deal a little bit different. To that end, I believe there are 7 to 9 countries that have access to nuclear weapons in the world. The concept of mutually assured destruction is possibly not something some countries could understand because of their religious influence. There's a specter of new countries getting the proliferation of nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on that facing this generation of young people like this one sitting up here that was baptized?
Thank you. So for those who didn't hear, it was about nuclear proliferation and whether it's feasible to prevent it in an age when so many countries have access to the technology. It's worth pausing just for a second and wondering at the quite extraordinary thing that these weapons have now been around for 75 years, and yet the number of nations that have acquired the technology is still in single figures. It's quite extraordinary in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's much harder than you'd think to get your hands on the plutonium or the enriched uranium. It's also quite extraordinary to me that in all of that time, there's never been any real question of them being used, even when one of the countries that possesses them has been in a full-scale war. Now, I think this would have surprised a lot of people in the late 40s and 50s. There was a very widespread view. Einstein, Carl Sagan, all sorts of people thought that pressing the button was a question of when rather than if in those days. And I can remember, I'm sure most of us can, I can remember growing up when the mushroom cloud was a familiar icon in popular culture, right? On record sleeves and movie posters and book covers, right? And yet it never happened. The US fought a major war in Vietnam, no real question of using nuclear weapons. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, no real question of our using nuclear weapons. It's as though with every non-use, the taboo grows higher. So the question then becomes, how do we keep it out of the hands of people who are not bound by the same rules as the rest of the human race? Either because they are religious fanatics, as you say, or because they've lost their grip on reality. This is why, something that I've been worried about this morning, actually, I've been thinking about this. I wonder whether, if I were Putin, I wouldn't be tempted to detonate a nuclear device somewhere uninhabited. Yeah? And my purpose in doing so would be twofold. First of all, to show that I'm prepared to do it, right? And that it is technically feasible, that there isn't some Star Wars type system that will shoot it down. And second, to show that no one would stop me, that there isn't any collective leadership in Russia that would step in and remove me before I press the button. I'd be very tempted if I were certain that it would work. Because the downside, if you're Putin and you're thinking of doing that, in order to strengthen your credibility vis-a-vis the West, is that it may well be shot down. He doesn't know what state our satellite defense system is. Or it may well be the thing that triggers his removal. So those are the issues he'll be weighing in the balance. But you're absolutely right, and I think we often forget this. Objectively, there are more nuclear weapons with more people with access to them, some of them of eccentric opinions, than there were when we were fretting about the mushroom clouds. And the human psychology is a funny thing, isn't it? It's like we can only hold one scare story in mind at a time. And because everyone is now worried about climate change, no one is fretting about nuclear war anymore, even though objectively it is probably closer than it was then. On which cheerful note, ladies and gentlemen, because, I'm always happy to leave you uplifted and cheerful, let me say again, thank you for having me in this wonderful town in Jackson. Thank you for having me in Mississippi, and thank you for having Douglas.